In an older video, I covered the history of Prinz Eugen, a German heavy cruiser often considered the luckiest ship of their navy. This was a ship that survived every attempt to sink her, becoming, in the process, the most sought-after prize when Germany surrendered. Ultimately, the ship would end up in the United States, where she would be commissioned into the Navy for testing and evaluation purposes. Let's look at that odd story now. As I have previously covered her German service, this video will focus on Prinz Eugen's time as a war prize. If you'd like more detail on her German career, I'll link that in the description. The same goes for the design details. Now, this story begins in May 1945 with the German surrender. Prinz Eugen, alongside the light cruiser Nuremberg, were the last major German warships in decent shape. Leipzig was also around, but she had never been properly repaired after Prinz Eugen rammed her. As for Eugen and Nuremberg, they were sailed, under very close escort, to Wilhelmshaven on May 27th. Once there, the ships were left in place as negotiations went on over the German fleet. The British, Soviets, and United States were all vying for pieces of the surrendered navy, with varying degrees of intensity and for various reasons. The United States was mostly interested in studying the more advanced U-boats while keeping the better ships away from the Soviets. For their part, the Soviets really wanted new ships to reinforce their navy, and the British wanted to keep ships away from the Red Navy while also being able to transfer their own prizes onto France. During this process, the German fleet was divided into three categories. Category A ships, including Prinz Eugen, were fully serviceable with, at worst, minor work required. Category B ships, by contrast, needed more work, but were still capable of being brought back into service within 3 to 6 months. And then there were Category C vessels, which were wrecks, ships that couldn't be brought back in service within a year, or that could never be repaired at all. Graf Zeppelin, for example, falls into this category. Each of the major navies would get a selection of these vessels. The main prizes, however, were Prinz Eugen and the fanciest new U-boats. While the latter could be divvied up between each fleet, there was only one Prinz Eugen. Both the British and Soviets were quite interested in gaining the ship. Less so the United States, other than to deny the ship to the Soviet Union. At this point, things vary a bit between sources. They do agree on one point, in the remaining ships being divided into 3 lots. One with Prinz Eugen, one with Nuremberg, and one with destroyers as the main feature. This is pretty well confirmed. On the other hand, there's a story about the American representative, one Captain Arthur Grobart, suggesting the lots be drawn from a hat. The luck of the draw in every meaning of the word. The most surprising thing about this story, if it's true, is that he got the Soviet and British representatives to agree to the idea. In any event, as the story goes, the British and Soviets drew first. The Soviets ended up with Nuremberg, which was commissioned into the Red Navy, as I covered in my Axis Ships in Soviet Service video. The British, for their part, ended up with the lot full of destroyers, and the United States ended up with Prinz Eugen. Was this really luck of the draw? Believe what you will there. In any case, this took place in October of 1945. The ship was then refit and resupplied for the trek across the Atlantic under Captain Grobart's command. He took most of the German crew, the former captain included, along for the ride. This mixed crew consisted of 574 Germans and 93 Americans. By this point, the cruiser had been formally commissioned into the United States Navy as USS Prinz Eugen IX-300. That designation, IX, was used for unclassified miscellaneous ships, everything from old sailing ships to Wolverine and Sable, and in this case, Prinz Eugen, making her one of very few cases of a foreign warship commissioned into the United States Navy. With that new designation, Prinz Eugen departed Germany on January 13, 1946, sailing for Boston. During this process, The mixed crew put the cruiser through her paces. These early tests revolved around figuring out how the ship worked and how she compared to American vessels. The real testing, however, began upon arrival in Boston. The cruiser arrived on January 22nd, where the ship had a swarm of technicians and engineers descend upon her. Absolutely everything of even remote interest to the Navy was studied at this point, with quite a bit of equipment removed. For example, the passive sonar was pulled off and installed on a submarine, USS Flying Fish, which looks quite interesting with that sonar installed. Much of the fire control equipment would also be removed. Not all of it, however. When sailing from Boston to Philadelphia in February, the cruiser put her 8-inch, 203mm guns to use. In this case, the Navy was testing how those weapons performed compared to their own models, which is probably a topic for a video all its own, although the simple answer is very high velocity and probably a very good belt puncher. After the Navy was finished testing those aboard the cruiser, Prinz Eugen would lose the 2 guns from her A turret. Most pictures of her as USS Prinz Eugen will, as a result, have the foremost turret empty. Those barrels were tested some more before one was scrapped in the 1950s. The other was put on display in Dahlgren, Virginia, where it was also scrapped at some point in the 1970s. 2 of the 105mm mounts were also pulled off, along with a set of torpedo tubes and some light anti-aircraft weaponry. What happened to those is an open question. I haven't found any information one way or another. As for the cruiser, testing continued on her until May of 1946. At that point, the remainder of the German crew was sent home. This group had gradually been growing smaller as men were let go and American sailors took over. In May, the last of them left. By this point, Prinz Eugen was on the west coast in San Diego. The cruiser had transited the Panama Canal before moving to California. It was here where the last German crew left, and the cruiser's fate was decided. Prinz Eugen would sail to Bikini Atoll as one of 3 war prizes for the Operation Crossroads testing. This would not go without incident, however. Without the German crew aboard, the ship almost immediately started breaking down. Sources will differ, but at least some of the boilers had major issues. This differs between one boiler, some boilers, or all but one boiler breaking down. The cruiser would still make it to Hawaii by May 19, 1946, at which point she was towed off to Bikini. The cruiser arrived on June 11, 1946, where she would remain until July 1st. On that day, Test Able, the first of 2 atomic tests, was performed. This airburst bomb would absolutely wreck her fellow Axis cruiser, Sakawa. Prinz Eugen, however, came out with no major damage, only a bent foremast and the top of the mainmast breaking off. This story would continue with Test Baker on July 25th. Prinz Eugen escaped this as well, with no notable damage. The cruiser was, however, heavily radioactive, so much so that she was towed off to Kwajalein for decontamination. All well and good to this point. However, while the apparent damage was minimal, there was actually a persistent leak. A leak that grew worse over time. Until, on December 21st, 1946, the cruiser was found listing and down by the stern. Prinz Eugen had been too radioactive to repair, and that was coming back to bite her. Boarding parties rushed aboard and found a failed C valve, which was flooding the cruiser rapidly. While an attempt was made to beach Prinz Eugen, this ultimately failed. The tugs lacked the proper power, and high winds made the issue worse. Prinz Eugen ended up grounding on a coral ledge and eventually rolling over around midnight on December 22, 1946. The cruiser was now capsized and sunk. However, she could have been raised if not for the lingering radiation. With that issue in mind, the Navy wrote off Prinz Eugen and left her in place. She remains there to this day, silently rusting away. An operation in 2018 removed much of the oil left in her tanks, and one of the props was removed in 1979. Otherwise, the cruiser remains much the same as when she sank, except now she's not particularly radioactive and is a popular diving spot. Certainly not the worst end for a ship, I suppose. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.